All right, so you're thinking about checking out Agatha Christie's and then There Were None, but you're not sure if it's worth your time.
It's a classic book.
Yeah, it's a classic, but like,
Yeah,
is it still relevant today?
exactly.
We get it. There are a ton of books out there and no one wants to waste time.
Right.
So let's just get to the point. Is this book still worth reading today?
Absolutely, even if you think you know the twist.
Well, hold on. Why is that?
Well, this book is incredibly influential. It basically created the entire locked room mystery genre as we know it.
I see, like the OG, the original.
Think about it. Think about it like watching the first Star Wars. Yeah, everyone knows Darth Vader is Luke's father now, but back then, mind-blowing.
I get that. I totally get that to set the stage.
Right.
But honestly, I've seen some mixed reviews online.
Mhm.
Some people are saying the characters feel a bit one-dimensional or stereotypical.
That's a fair point, especially for modern readers. I mean, some characters like the gruff Philip Lombard or the rigidly moral Emily Brent, they might seem a bit like stock characters at first, but what's really remarkable is how Christie still manages to make every single one of them suspicious. You find yourself like second-guessing everyone's motives,
Even though their personalities aren't very complex.
even if they're not super complex.
So it's more about the suspense than, like, getting to know the characters deeply.
Exactly. Christie was amazing at building suspense.
Okay.
She uses that creepy nursery rhyme and the isolated setting of Soldier Island, and right away you get this sense of dread right from the very first page.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
And the way she uses a third-person omniscient narrator, brilliant. She gives us little peeks into each character's thoughts, which adds to that feeling of paranoia. Keeps you on the edge of your seat.
Okay, so she's really playing with our minds here. But let's be real. This book was published back in 1939. Doesn't it feel a bit dated?
Well,
Some reviewers have mentioned the language feeling a bit old-fashioned.
yeah, I mean, the language, yes, it can feel a little bit dated, but think of it as a time capsule. Reading it today is like you're getting a glimpse into the social norms and anxieties of the 1930s. And honestly, that slightly formal style actually enhances the book's eerie, almost gothic atmosphere. It's like you're stepping back in time, and that adds a whole other layer to the reading experience.
So it adds to the charm, like a vintage find.
Exactly.
I can see that. But what about the plot itself? I mean, haven't we seen this before? 10 strangers on an island start dying off one by one. It sounds a bit like a game of Clue, no.
It absolutely does.
Right.
And that's no coincidence. And then There Were None was a huge influence on Clue and, well, countless other mysteries. Books, films, video games, you name it. But knowing the basic premise, it doesn't actually ruin the enjoyment. Christie was a master at execution. The way she gives out clues, builds the tension, throws in those red herrings, she's masterful. You might have an idea of the ending, but the journey is still a wild ride. Think of it like watching a magic trick. You know, the magician isn't really sawing someone in half, but it's still entertaining, right? You still enjoy the showmanship and anticipation of the big reveal.
You're really selling this. So even if I think I know who did it, I'll still enjoy reading it,
Oh, yeah,
you think?
absolutely. It's like a puzzle box, right? You might know there's a secret compartment, but the real fun is figuring out exactly how to open it. And Christie was like a master puzzle maker.
Okay, I'm getting more and more intrigued. But some of the reviews online mentioned it can be pretty dark. Is it actually scary?
Well, scary is subjective, of course, but I would say it is definitely unsettling. Christie, she doesn't rely on like jump scares or gore. It's psychological tension that she uses. She takes these characters, traps them on an island with a killer, and then just slowly ratchets up the paranoia. You actually start to feel the character's fear and desperation, and that gets under your skin.
You mentioned earlier that the book reflects some of the social anxieties of the 1930s. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So the book, it was actually originally published under a different title, one that we can't even mention today because it's so offensive. The title alone caused a lot of controversy, and it really reflects some of the societal attitudes of the time.
Wow.
And the book itself, it really grapples with themes of guilt, punishment, and the idea of whether or not we can ever escape our past.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how Christie weaves these themes into a really gripping mystery, you know? It makes you question not just who the killer is, but like the very nature of justice itself.
Whoa, that's deep. It's interesting that you bring up the original title. Some reviewers mentioned the ending, specifically the epilogue, feels a bit too neat and tidy considering those dark themes you just mentioned. What are your thoughts?
The epilogue. It's definitely something that divides readers. See, Christie lays out the killer's entire plan and their motivation in detail.
Uh-huh.
Some people, they find it really satisfying, they want to have all the pieces of the puzzle laid out in front of them.
Right.
But others, they feel like it's too much, like Christie's robbing them of the chance to come to their own conclusions.
I see what you mean.
It all comes down to personal preference.
Yeah.
Do you enjoy a clear resolution, or do you like to have things a little bit more open-ended?
I think I'd prefer a bit of ambiguity, personally.
Okay.
But, it raises another question.
Mm-hmm.
You've been comparing this book to Clue, and we talked about how influential it's been on other mysteries.
Right.
But how is And Then There Were None different from Agatha Christie's other novels? For example, I've seen the movies Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, and they seem very focused on Hercule Poirot and, his brilliant deductions.
That is such a great observation. Those novels, they are really all about Poirot, his brilliance, his methodical approach to solving puzzles.
Yeah.
But And Then There Were None. There is no Poirot to come and save the day. The focus is just on these 10 individuals, their past sins, and their fight to survive.
Cool.
It's a much more claustrophobic and intense experience because there isn't the safety net of a brilliant detective.
Right.
And that makes it all the more chilling.
So if someone's looking for a more traditional detective story,
Yeah.
maybe they'd be better off with one of those other Christie novels.
Exactly.
But if they want something darker, something more psychological, and with a truly shocking ending.
And Then There Were None is
Yeah.
the perfect choice.
We've talked about the suspense, the historical context, the ending, but we haven't really delved into the characters themselves.
Right.
You mentioned some might seem a bit stereotypical,
Mm-hmm.
but do any of them deserve our sympathy? I mean, they're all accused of murder.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And it's one that Christie intentionally leaves for the reader to wrestle with. Yes, every single one of them has done something terrible. But are they all equally guilty? Are some of them victims of circumstance? And who are we to judge? It's easy to just condemn them from a distance. But Christie, she makes us consider their perspectives, their motivations, their own feelings of guilt. It adds this whole layer of moral complexity that elevates the book beyond your typical whodunit.
Wow. So it's making us think, making us question things. That complexity is definitely intriguing.
Yeah.
You painted a pretty vivid picture of this book.
Yeah.
It's suspenseful, it has this historical context, it's morally ambiguous.
Right.
But let's be honest, a lot of our listeners probably just want to know, is it actually fun to read?
Oh, yeah, of course. It's a page-turner, literally. The mystery is so compelling, the death's so creative, that you can't help but race through it just to find out who's behind it all. And even if you've seen the plot twists coming a mile away, there's still something so enjoyable about seeing how Christie's intricate plan unfolds.
So even with the dark themes and potentially dated language, you'd still say it's a fun and engaging read.
Absolutely, without a doubt. It's a book that will stay with you long after you've finished it.
Oh, wow.
It makes you think about justice and morality and the darker side of human nature.
Really heavy stuff.
And honestly, what more could you want from a good mystery?
I think you've convinced me, and hopefully our listeners, too. We'll be right back after a short break. All right, we're back, and we're ready to dive deeper into Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None.
Let's do it.
So before the break, you were really selling us on how fun and engaging this book is, even though some people might find it a bit dated or predictable.
Right.
But you also mentioned that it can get pretty dark and unsettling.
Yeah, it definitely has its creepy moments. Remember those 10 individuals trapped on an island?
Oh, for sure. With a mysterious killer on the loose. No thanks.
Exactly. Christie was so good at building that suspense. She doesn't need jump scares or gore to make you feel uneasy. It's that slow burn, that feeling of isolation and paranoia that really gets to you.
I can see that. Like you start to put yourself in their shoes and it gets under your skin.
Exactly.
You also mentioned earlier that this book reflects some of the social anxieties of the 1930s.
Oh, absolutely.
Could you maybe tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. One of the biggest things is the book's original title.
Oh, yeah. The one that's super controversial.
Yeah, the one we can't even say on the air today.
Right.
It really shows you how much society has changed since then. Even back then, it was a huge controversy.
Wow.
The book also dives into some pretty heavy themes. Guilt, punishment, the idea of whether we can ever truly escape our past.
That's some deep stuff.
It really makes you think, and that's what's so fascinating about it. Christie manages to weave all these complex themes into a gripping mystery. It makes you question not just who the killer is, but the nature of justice itself.
That's amazing. It's interesting that you brought up that original title because some reviewers mentioned that the ending, specifically the epilogue, feels a bit too neat and tidy given those dark themes you were just talking about. What are your thoughts on that?
Ah, the epilogue. It's definitely a divisive one. Some readers love it, some hate it.
I can see that.
Christie lays out the killer's entire plan, all their motivations, in detail.
So like all the cards are on the table, no mystery left.
Right, and for some people that's exactly what they want. They like that sense of closure, having all the pieces of the puzzle finally revealed. But other readers feel like it's a bit too much.
So she's spelling it out for them.
Yeah, they feel cheated out of the chance to come to their own conclusion.
Yes, that's a good point.
So I think it really comes down to personal preference. Some people like things tied up neatly. Others enjoy a bit of ambiguity.
Makes sense. I guess it's like in movies. Some people love a happy ending, and some people prefer something more open-ended.
Exactly.
You know, speaking of different preferences, it makes me wonder, how does And Then There Were None compare to Agatha Christie's other novels?
Yeah.
We talked about how it's different from those classic Hercule Poirot stories like Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile.
Right.
But are there other books by her that it's more similar to?
That's a good question. And Then There Were None is kind of unique in Christie's work.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's one of her few books that doesn't feature a recurring detective like Poirot or Miss Marple. It's really just about these 10 characters isolated on an island with a killer among them.
Right, right.
So if you're looking for that classic detective story where you follow along with a brilliant detective's thought process, you might want to check out some of her other books. But if you want something more claustrophobic, more psychological, And Then There Were None is the way to go.
So it's kind of like its own special thing.
Exactly. It's a standalone story that really stands out in Christie's bibliography.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the suspense, the historical context, the ending.
Yeah.
But we haven't really talked about the characters themselves.
True.
You mentioned earlier that some of them might feel a bit stereotypical.
Yeah,
But do any of the characters in this story actually deserve our sympathy?
that's a great question. And it's one that Christie deliberately leaves for the reader to wrestle with.
So she's not giving us easy answers here.
Nope. I mean, all of these characters have done something awful, right? They're all accused of murder. But are they all equally guilty? Are some of them victims of circumstance? Who are we to judge?
I see what you mean.
Okay.
It's easy to just write them all off as bad guys.
But Christie makes us consider things from their perspectives. What were their motivations? How do they feel about their own guilt?
It's like she's humanizing them even though they've done terrible things.
Exactly. And that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the story. It makes you think about justice and morality in a way that most mysteries don't.
You've painted a really compelling picture of this book. The suspense, the historical context, the characters, the moral ambiguity. But ultimately, our listeners want to know, is it a fun read? Will they enjoy spending time with this book?
Absolutely. It's such a page-turner.
Okay, good.
The mystery is so well crafted, the pacing is perfect, and the ending will leave you thinking long after you've finished reading.
So even with the dark themes and potentially dated language, you think it's worth the read?
Without a doubt, it's a classic for a reason, and it's definitely worth experiencing for yourself.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot about And Then There Were None. Let's wrap it up after a quick break.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on And Then There Were None.
We talked about the good, the bad, the history, the influence, even got into the moral questions.
Right.
So for our listeners, what's the bottom line? Should they add And Then There Were None to their reading lists?
In a word, yes. It may not be Christie's most sophisticated book, but it's still essential for any mystery fan.
You've said a few times it's a quick read, and a lot of people are pressed for time. How's it compared to her other books, lengthwise?
Oh, that's another great thing about it. It's a lot shorter than some of her other famous ones, like Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile. You could easily knock it out in like 2 sittings.
So perfect for a weekend, a long flight.
Exactly. It's ideal for people who love mystery but maybe don't have the time for a huge, epic story.
Like it's a good intro to Agatha Christie if you haven't read her before.
Exactly. It's a perfect intro to her writing style, the way she plots, and how she builds suspense, even from ordinary things.
And just to remind everyone,
Yeah.
you don't need to be a Christie expert to enjoy this one.
Nope.
It's a standalone, you can jump right in.
And here's the best part. Even if you think you've got it all figured out, Christie's probably still going to surprise you. She's so good at those twists and turns.
All right, so there you have it. You've got all the info, now it's up to you to decide if "And Then There Were None" makes the cut for your reading list. We think it should. It's a classic for a reason. Give it a try.
And one last thought before you go. We've talked about how morally gray the characters are and the killer's reasons. Does anyone in this story truly deserve sympathy? That's something to think about even after you finish the book.
That's a great question to leave everyone with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into "And Then There Were None." We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.